Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades in the Pan-African struggle for liberation. Good morning to those who are in the far west. Good day for those who are in the Central African time zone. And good evening to those who are in the far east. I would like to welcome you to this August gathering of Africans and people of African descent. We welcome those who come from the African continent, from Asia, from the Caribbean, from Europe, from Latin America, North America, and from Oceania. We have representatives from all those areas. We also welcome our special guests from the Aboriginal people around the world and some from Palestine. I'm going to ask our prayer team to lead us in prayers and meditation, Reverend Dr. Mickey Roberts.
Thank you so much, Reverend Frank Shikane, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who are gathered with us today. Today, as we begin our conference, we will be saying a prayer in a number of languages and being done by representatives from across the diaspora. And so we will begin with the prayer, the same prayer being said, done by Latin America. And then I will say it on behalf of our brothers and sisters in Europe. And then we go to North America and the Caribbean, and then we end in Africa. Let us then go before God in prayer.
Dios de sabiduría y luz, guía e inspira en estos días que nos reunimos. Deus de sabedoria e de luz, guia-nos e inspira-nos nestes dias em que nos reunimos.
Amen.
Amen.
God of wisdom, God of light, guide and inspire us as we gather. Amen.
Amen.
God of wisdom, God of light, guide and inspire us as we gather. Amen.
Amen.
Watsibo likhanya ika o ka re gantsetsa tsela o re matlafatse hantse re kopana. Amen.
And so we give God thanks for this prayer, and we pray that we will be guided over these next days by the God of wisdom and by the God of light. Amen.
Thank you very much. I must remember to unmute. May I make a number of announcements? Firstly, for interpretation, you go to the right, there's a chat there. When you go to chat, it will give you interpretation and you choose the language you would want to listen to the discussions through which you would want to participate. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you can make your comments on the chat, those who have access to it, and raise questions if you want to do so. The chat is available for those who have access. There are those we are streaming, and there are those who will be listening around the world through the streaming facility. And we wish them luck as they participate. Can I just welcome the diplomatic corps? We invited all the African and Caribbean diplomatic corps. And we welcome them. I've noticed that some of them are here already. We also welcome the rest of the diplomats who are here with us. Would like to also welcome and honor our patrons, the patrons for this conference. There are about 20 of them. You can go to the website, you'll get all the names of the patrons, and we really appreciate their support. As we welcome all of you, I would like us to recall the mothers and fathers of Pan-Africanism, starting from Du Bois, Ashley and Marcus Garvey, and many others who went on this road before we came. They encoded this consciousness in us that although we were in the main brutally and forcefully separated, subjected to acts of genocide and gross human rights violations, we must not forget that we are siblings. And that's what they've made us to understand, that we are a family, we belong to each other, and we have got a common struggle we have to wage together against the negative, oppressive, and exploitative systems that are determined to keep us as their slaves, though free. My co-convener, Reverend Angelique Walker-Smith from the United States, will introduce this conference and its objectives to you. For now, I just want to say that the visionaries of this conference determined that no one was going to set us free or liberate us, and that we have to liberate ourselves, using the title of Jalil Mantik's book, We Are Our Liberators. Bob Marley has these lyrics: emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And this was inspired by one of the last speeches of Marcus Garvey. The visionaries of this conference also took seriously Frantz Fanon's injunction that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Like the Manchester 1945 leadership, we are at the verge of changing the world, and it is in our hands to do so. So I would like to really thank our speakers, particularly thank President Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, for agreeing to participate in this session. But unfortunately, because of the virtual mode of conferencing, he could not fit into our time, and he has assigned Minister Nathi Mthethwa to speak on his behalf, and would like to welcome Minister Mthethwa. And we also would like to welcome former President Mbeki. I will introduce them at the right time when they come to speak. For now, I would like to invite and introduce Professor Achille Mbembe. And Professor Achille Mbembe is a philosopher, political scientist, public intellectual. He obtained his doctoral degree at the University of Paris I in 1989, and subsequently obtained the DED in political science. Professor Mbembe is a research professor of history and politics at Wits, Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a visiting professor in the Department of Romance Studies at the Franklin Humanities Institute, Duke University. He has also held appointments in Columbia University, Berkeley, Yale University, and the University of California. Professor, we are meeting virtually at your university, and we're asking you to welcome us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Reverend Chikane, Reverend Angelique. I'm welcoming all of us on behalf of Professor Zebulon Vilakazi, who couldn't be with us this afternoon, and who is the Vice Chancellor of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is a pleasure to be listening soon to the message, as Frank said, of President Ramaphosa, which will be delivered by Minister Ntetwa, and to listen to our brother and our former president, President Thabo Mbeki, whose work on behalf of Africa and all its descendants has been remarkable. As we meet here today, it remains very clear that humanity not only was born in our continent, it also remains that there is no part of our entire world where Africa is not present. We are not only the elder daughter of our planet, we are also its youngest member. And as our world is undergoing a tremendous pressure caused by not only the pandemic we are still confronting, but even more so, the danger of life extinction as such through climate change, it seems to many of us that the long experience humanity has gathered in this continent and abroad might be of vital use for the times to come, not only for ourselves and our descendants all over the world, but for the world at large. It also seems to many of us that unless our continent stands on its own feet, a lot will remain to be done. And that it is, as Reverend Frank Chikane was mentioning in his short introduction, it is our responsibility to the world to make it such that this continent stands on its own feet. So the University of the Witwatersrand is delighted to host all of us, brothers, sisters, the same family, as he said. And we are eager, as I said early on, to listen to President Ramaphosa's message and to President Mbeki's keynote address. So God bless Africa and God bless our world. Thank you, Reverend Chikane.
Thank you very much, Professor, for welcoming us. We feel welcomed here, but virtually. You know, the pandemic has sent us into a virtual mode. I'm now going to introduce my sister and co-convener, Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, is a senior associate for Pan-African and Orthodox faith engagement at Bread for the World in Washington, D.C. She brings extensive global and national and local experience as a faith and public engagement thought leader, journalist, speaker, broadcaster, scholar, preacher, and author. She has received a number of awards from President Clinton and various other leaders in the United States. She received a doctoral degree from Princeton Theological University and is former executive director, minister of the Church Council in Greater Indianapolis, Indiana. She's a member of the Home Mission Board for the National Baptist Convention, USA, a World Council of Churches and National Council of Churches board member, and she's president of the historical Black churches at one of the widest represented bodies of national churches and their related networks in the United States. Most recently, which is critical to note, she was selected to be a member of the preparatory working group for the new United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. She is also the international co-convener, as I've said, with myself. And I would like to welcome my sister to speak on the conference so we know as we start what it is about. Angelique.
Thank you so much, Reverend Chikane, and to all of the esteemed guests, to President Mbeki, to the minister representing President Ramaphosa, to all of the distinguished speakers and panelists, and to all of you, my brothers and sisters, wherever you may be. On behalf of the International Committee of the Africans and Diaspora Manchester Conference, I would like to join my esteemed co-convener, the Reverend Frank Chikane, in welcoming you to this historic From Manchester to 1945 to a Pan-Africa Renaissance, the Shared Journey, Past, Present, and Future, AAD Conference. Yesterday, this conference got underway with a substantive and inspirational women's pre-conference consultation that addressed the theme of telling her stories, exploring women's leadership before and at the Manchester Pan-African Congress and beyond. This has been a long journey of arriving to this point of the Pan-African Conferencing. First and foremost, we come standing on the majestic shoulders of our ancestors who came before us hundreds of years ago. Those who gave their lives for our benefit, the mothers and fathers who stood strong and resilient during horrific periods of struggle, but by faith, with boldness and unmitigated courage, led us and who made it possible by God's grace to bring us thus far. Truly, as the gospel song of people from the African diaspora wrote, great was, great is, and great will be our faithfulness. This week's conference is no different. It seeks to be faithful to the Pan-African and spiritual heritage we share in this Sankofa moment of Ubuntu. It seeks to address the themes of the previous Pan-African Congresses of women and men from 1900 until now, with a particular focus on the 1945 Manchester Conference. Our regional, South African host and international teams have come together since 2018, when Africans and people of African descent met alongside of the World Council of Churches Governing Board meeting of the Central Committee at Balsay Institute, University of Geneva. This is a usual practice since the World Assembly in 1998, when President Mandela and President Banana and Prime Minister Mugabe addressed us, and people like the Reverend Sam Kobia envisioned such a practice in ecumenical life. But in 2018, we said it was time to do more than meet strategically at this governing meeting, but to create a new and timely space to further our Pan-African agenda together. The All Africa Conference of Churches, CETA, Assembly followed suit that summer in this regard in Kigali, Rwanda. And from there, the International Committee was formally formed, and the work commenced to follow our legacy into a new future. We had originally thought we would be meeting in person in the beautiful home of South Africa, where the historic Durban Conference on Racism was hosted by the UN in 2001, when our keynote speaker today, the former President Thabo Mbeki, was president. But at last, the pandemic prevented this possibility. Still, it was decided we must move forward with courage and a certain boldness by God's grace and a lot of hard work. And so here we are. We gather on the eve of the 11th World Assembly of the World Council of Churches, as well as the rhythm of a new Pan-African Renaissance moment. The conference where we visit the historical 1945 Manchester Pan-African Conference and critically review progress made since then, as well as determine strategies and develop global strategies to radically change the lot of Africans and people of African descent globally, and thereby defeat the scourge of racism and Afrophobia in the world. The conference is convened on the backdrop of the 20th anniversary of the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances. And of course, the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 to 2024. And yes, immediately after the creation of a new permanent forum of people of African descent, supported by our African kindred, as of last month at the United Nations Assembly, with the adoption of a new United Nations statement, United We Stand Against Racism resolution to help guide the way forward. We gather as we more fully embrace the African Union Constitutive Act, which considers Africans in diaspora, the sixth region of the African Union. We gather with the recognition of the quadcentennial of the transatlantic slave trade to Jamestown in Virginia in the United States, from the shores of Angola, and earlier such acts to Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, and even other parts of the world where the African diaspora resides. We gather with the year of return to Ghana in 2019 related to this movement, and the new movement of rewriting our own narratives and decolonizing knowledge in places like the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., the Pan-African Museum in Ghana, and the new International Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. These historic places of the transatlantic slave trade that built the modern, quote, industrial day on the backs and exploited labor of Pan-African peoples. We gather in the season of the Black Lives Matter movement that was further ignited by the recent tragic death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many more in the US and globally, that has raised the consciousness of the world about structural and systemic racism in renewed ways globally. We gather with a series of regional and international webinars that have offered substantive thought reflection that has led us to this moment. Our website provides these resources. Yes, this conference will address the following thematic streams with the goal of developing outcomes, which will be embodied in a conference declaration or manifesto with clear policy statements and action plans to which all of us are invited to create during this week. What is unique about this conference is the preparatory methodology or approach, which requires various regions where Africans and people of African descent are found to reflect on their history of struggles for liberation, workshop strategies to end the conditions in which we find ourselves, as well as determine aspects on which we can collaborate globally to radically change the lot of our people internationally for the betterment of our children. The daily themes are as follows. On today, we will have our opening ceremony as we are presently engaged. We will reflect on the transatlantic slave trade, colonization, and colonialism, and the partitioning of Africa, and look at the critical issue of racism. Tomorrow, we will look at the issues of decolonity, reparations, and Pan-African spirituality. On October the 26th, We will explore critical multilateral international organizations and what they're offering in this moment for space for our voices to be heard. Session number 4 will be on October the 27th, addressing economic liberation, climate change, and justice, and an equitable international order. And then on October the 28th, Pan-Africanism with all and for all. And then we will conclude on the 29th of October on the theme of the shared journey, reimagining and engaging the future. This will be a time to, again, direct the new declaration and manifesto. Yes, there will be time for all of us to engage through the chat, regional meetings and otherwise. So welcome to the historic From Manchester 1945 to a Pan-African Renaissance, the Shared Journey, Past, Present, and Future Conference. You are most welcome. Thank you, Reverend Chikane.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reverend Angelique Walker-Smith. We have been on this journey together for now about 3 years, 2.5 years, and we have a long way to go. This is just the beginning of what we envisioned we would do. Thank you very much for the briefing. We're now going to invite our Honorable Minister Nathi Mthethwa, Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture. As I had indicated, will be speaking in the place of the President. He has been in Parliament since 2002, and he has served as a Minister of Safety and Security and Police before he was appointed as Sports, Culture and Arts. Mr. Mthethwa holds a diploma in community development from the University of Natal, certificate in mining engineering from University of Johannesburg, and a certificate in communications and leadership from Rhodes University. As a member of Parliament, he has served as chair of the Minerals and Energy Portfolio Committee. He's been a chief whip of the African National Congress in 2008. He also served on the board of directors of the 2010 FIFA World Cup Local Organizing Committee. We welcome you, Honorable Minister, as you take the platform to speak on behalf of the President. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and thanks for your kind words of welcome to you and Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, the co-conveners of this, the African Diaspora Conference 2021, to His Excellency, former President Thabo Mbeki, Your Excellencies here present, esteemed delegates, sons and daughters of the African soil, wherever you are located, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. Thank you for this very important invitation. And let me, on the onset, shower with felicitations the organizers of this conference for convening such a timely and potentially impactful gathering. I bring you greetings from the President of the Republic of South Africa, the government and the people. It is most special to be in company that reflects on the past, present, and destiny for our Mother Africa. I'm happy and honored to be in this historic gathering. Some of the ideas I will briefly highlight are reflective of South African government policy positions in advancement of Pan-African agenda. If there was time, I would give a full account of various projects that our government has undertaken in partnership with other African countries in the region and in the rest of the continent to advance in concrete terms the ideal of Pan-Africanism. Suffice to say, more needs to be done to make real the promises of the African Union's Agenda 2063, as well as the concepts of the 6th African region that represents the African diaspora. So this gathering is perfectly timed for Africans in the continent and those in the diaspora to put heads together to take stock and reflect on the implications of current global trends and locate positioning of Africans. Major trends that define this moment of the 21st century may as well be ushering a new global epoch in which new global institutional arrangements and rules may be reviewed. In the past centuries, the global order has been shaped without active participation of Africans, and very often Africans and Africa has been a pawn in these geopolitical issues. To mention but a few, one, the transatlantic slavery, two, the 1884 Berlin Conference, in which the African continent was partitioned by European powers. Three, colonialism and apartheid. Four, the post-Second World War reconfiguration of world institutions and rules. And fifthly, the Cold War and more recent post-Cold War. All these have been described as the waves of the scrambles of Africa. What must be the central focus of this gathering is whether we collectively can allow yet another scramble for Africa well into the third and subsequent decades of the 21st century. Can we reclaim the 21st century as the African century, as an eminent Pan-Africanist visionary of our times? Thabo Mbeki once proclaimed in his articulation of the African Renaissance. Can we marshal our intellectual resources into turning Africa's demographic and resources dividends into catalyst for Africa's sustainable development? Using this network of Pan-Africanists can place the African agenda at the heart of the new emerging global system and ensure that nothing about us can be decided without us. At the dawn of the 20th century, great Pan-Africanists gathered to set an agenda that largely influenced the struggles for African self-determination. Can we seize this moment to consolidate all ideas on how to shape the Pan-African agenda of the 21st century and learning from challenges that faced previous efforts? COVID-19, current global climate change and its environmental implications, fourth industrial revolution, as well as geopolitical reconfigurations across the world are converging to shape a new world order and define a new epoch. The most pressing question for a Pan-African forum of this nature is how should Africa locate itself and play a role in shaping trajectory of this seismic global shift? How should Africa be a co-creator than a victim of these changes? How do we take the works of great Pan-Africanists such as Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Pixley Isaac Aseme, Kwame Nkrumah, to mention but a few, forward? Pan-Africanism is not only important for Africans or to Africans, but to humanity as a whole. It creates the greatest possibility of giving humanity a more humane face, as Steve Bantu Biko once put it. It also creates the greatest possibility of realizing universal justice, equity, human dignity, and human freedom. Progressive thought affirms that the violation of human dignity anywhere is tantamount to a violation of collective human dignity universally. Africans are the ones who have and still continue to receive the greatest and most consistent violations of their human rights dignity and human rights for the longest time in recent recorded history. This has not been met with passivity, but with robust and systematic activism organizing, and unity measures. It is fitting that we pay tribute to many visionary men and women who carved the first yards of the multi-million-mile journey we and our descendants are on for African unity, sovereignty, dignity, and a better life for all. Amongst them, Phyllis Whitley, Oloda Equiano, and Otoba Kugwano, Edward Wilmot Bladen, Toussaint Louverture, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, George Padmore, Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Henry Eloquent Johnson, Henry Sylvester Williams, Alice Kinloch, Thomas J. Johnson, the list is long. Most of these luminaries' work opened up the path to the founding of the African Association in 1897, an important precursor to 1900 conference in Westminster town with only 37 delegates. These delegates included Henry Sylvester Williams and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Bishop Alexander Walters of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, to which our own Charlotte Maxeke belonged, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the drafter of the letter to the nation, in which he appealed to leaders from the West to Europe to struggle against racism, grand colonies in Africa and the West Indies, the right to self-government, and demanded political and other rights for African Americans. This early wave of Pan-Africanism must have triggered that, must have been a trigger that awakened consciousness in the life of a young South African, Pixley Isaac Semenya, who studied in Columbia University. In his seminal work on the regeneration of Africa, he demonstrated both the grasp and devotion to a Pan-Africanist thought as early as 1906. Let me also acknowledge the founders of our own African National Congress and other liberation movements, the founders of Organization of African Unity, in their rich tapestry of perspectives and visions spanning from Addis to Accra, from Casablanca to Monrovia, and many others. The time has come to draw the best from each of these traditions, to examine their choices in the context of their time and better use our resource of hindsight. Walter Rodney, Sheikh Anta Diop, Mwalimu Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, Charlotte Maxeke, and many others who came before and after them, the founders of the African Union and its associated mechanisms. W.E.B. Du Bois could not have better captured the matter that is before us today, as he did in his what has almost become cliché now, when he said, and I quote, "The problem of the 20th century will be the problem of color question," close quote. Even as we traverse the 21st century, the color question is still with us. The Black Lives Matter movement is an indication of how Africans across the world are still worse victims of institutionalized discrimination. Its particular manifestation is that peoples of Africa, of African descent, everywhere are having the short end of the stick. All kinds of negativities are perpetrated on them. They don't enjoy the full liberation and sovereignty at national and international levels that were envisioned by the watershed conferences of 1900 and 1945. The concept document of this very gathering confirms that African people are yet to enjoy full political, economic, social, cultural freedom, environmental freedom, sovereignty, and self-determination. I may add that in spite of the digital and virtual environment gaining such global ascendancy, the African enjoys neither adequate access nor sovereignty or leadership in this space. We should build on initiatives such as increasing collaborations between the AU and the Caribbean community, the CARICOM. CARICOM's call for reparatory justice the Black Lives Matter movements across the world, and the UN International Decade for People of African Descent from 2015 to 2024. The UN International Decade of People of African Descent is ultimately the result of processes that were created by the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. The year 2021 marks the 20th anniversary of this conference and the world's most comprehensive human rights instrument against racism, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. It is therefore for this gathering to take a moment to highlight and reflect on the achievements, challenges, and areas which need urgent attention from the resolutions of the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in the light of the current upsurge of the scourge around the world. Imperialism and neocolonialism have been major drivers and beneficiaries of conflicts in Africa. Africa's efforts through the AU Vision 2063 to silence the guns, ensure peaceful environments, democratically elected governments supported by continental peer review mechanisms can be a valuable contribution to checking the power and influence of imperialism and neocolonialism in Africa. Governments that are more accountable to Africans are good for Africa and bad for imperialism. Africans need to feel secure from every form of violence, including crime and war. Our military and security work needs to be backed by sustained ideological and cultural work to entrench a culture of mutual respect, mutual understanding, and the promotion of values of Ubuntu, which is that you are because I am, our humanity is intertwined. Security solutions alone will not deliver a long-term solution. The role of the intelligentsia in the remaking of any society is well established through the ages, all over the world. Our efforts to unite and renew Africa must include a clear intellectual agenda. African unification must include unification of the educational, academic, science, health, and research space. The future of democracy in the world and in Africa has been shaken by many factors, amongst them the adverse and often abusive influence of business and foreign governments on government processes, the changed ways in which wars are conducted, the gross imbalance arising from a unipolar world, the growth in the roles of non-state actors, the increasing awareness of shared identities across borders, other global examples of transnational collaborations, the increased alienation of citizenry from political and business elite systems, the failure of quality control of the electoral political systems, resulting in leaders that are incongruent to the political setup, the demobilization of the labor and human rights movement, the speed at which global phenomena change, the impact of social media, virtual space accompanied by dramatic demographic changes, and the VUCA or VUCA moment, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous nature of the world we are faced with. These factors might demand a rethink on the governance and government models, demand a rethink on the shape, form, substance, and content of what African unity should mean. Has time not arrived to go beyond agreements between and amongst governments? What kind of African unity should we have? What kinds of government and social organization should we be targeting? Program Director, in conclusion, there is a need to take stock of various ideas that emerge from previous and current fora, update and consolidate them into concrete implementable programs with timelines for evaluating progress. It may also be proper at this stage to emerge with a clear institutional arrangement for managing and coordinating activities of this forum, given its importance and potential. AU and broader civil society organizations ought to play a greater role in the advancement of programs of this network. South African government and its people are ready to play their part as part of this network, as our survival and prosperity depends on that of the entire continent and African people in general. There is a greater need and urgency in having African intelligentsia, policymakers, business and civil society organizations working together to ensure that the Pan-African ideals become real. It is in our hands. And I want to thank you kindly for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister. I am really pleased that the government of South Africa is with us through and through. And from your address, it's clear that we have a partner in the struggle together. So I would like to really appreciate your input and contribution, and also convey to the government of South Africa that we appreciate the assistance they've given us in making this conference a success. So thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you, Minister. Can we then move to the next item, which is the keynote address? Former President Mbeki, I just want to say that they gave me a long story here to tell the people about where you were born, where you grew up, and all those details. I'm not going to take your time for addressing us. I'm just going to say to the listeners, those who are participating here, that President Mbeki joined the African National Congress Youth League when he was 13 years old. And in 1962, he left for exile, studied economics at Sussex, and has been a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. He's been part of those who developed the policy positions on South Africa, Africa, and the rest of the world. I just want to say, President, what I would like to recognize is that we worked together. I worked under you when you developed the vision of the African renewal, African Renaissance. And by the time you left government, we were just about to have a summit with CARICOM and the AU. And I would like to say, sir, that in the last few weeks, as you know, that summit happened. I think it was for the second time. And we are pleased to have you as a keynote speaker in this conference. And I would like to hand over to you, sir, to address us.
And thank you very much, Reverend Chikane, for that introduction. Co-conveners of conference, the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith and Reverend Dr. Frank Chikane, Professor Achille Mbembe, the Honorable Minister Nathi Mthethwa, distinguished delegates, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed honored to join our eminent co-conveners, to join them to welcome everybody to this important conference. I must also thank everybody who was involved in conceiving of the very idea that all of us as Africans or people of African descent should get together, as we have done since yesterday. And I'm certain that all of us are familiar with the objectives of the conference, as been explained just now by Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, and in the documents circulated to all of us by the co-conveners. With regard to the documents, I'm referring specifically to this statement that the AAD African Diaspora Conference aims to be a working session and platform for open discussion to inform and develop strategies that will radically change the conditions in which Africa and the African diaspora find themselves. And key to this discussion is the return of Africa and people of African descent back to a competitive leadership position in science and technology, socioeconomic, spiritual, and political developments in the world. In addition, we'll recall that we've also been challenged to adopt as our starting point the famous 1945 Fifth Pan-African Conference, as Dr. Walker-Smith has just said, the 1945 Fifth Pan-African Conference, and therefore ask ourselves the question, what progress have we made towards achieving the objectives set by that conference? And specifically, the document I've cited says that although there have been huge achievements in changing the conditions of Africans and Africans in the diaspora since the 1945 Manchester Pan-African Conference, political developments affecting Africans and people of African descent globally in the last few years suggests that we are not winning the battle against underdevelopment, poverty, and the old demon of racism, unquote. And the statements I've just quoted make two vitally important points. One of these is that people of African descent, including in that all Africans, share socioeconomic deprivation because of racist discrimination, which affects them wherever they are. The second is implied in the reference to the 1945 Pan-African Congress. What is implied is that the fact of that shared burden must encourage us to unite in action and thus use our collective strength to achieve our socioeconomic upliftment, as well as the competitive leadership position, which has been mentioned. I believe that as we discuss among ourselves what we could and should do in this regard, we must take on board the important work being done within the United Nations system on the very issue of people of African descent, to which, again, Reverend Dr. Walker-Smith has just referred. I know that as used by the UN system, the designation people of African descent refers to those outside of Africa, the diaspora. However, I suggest that for our purposes, we should include within this designation people within Africa. This is because in many instances, what are identified as ills affecting the African diaspora apply with equal force with the continental Africans. Thus, for purposes of comparison, for instance, the situation of the continental African should be weighed against that of people elsewhere in the world. With this qualification in mind, bringing together Africans and the African diaspora, I will then discuss what the UN says about people of African descent. Again, as Dr. Walker-Smith and indeed Minister Mthethwa have just done, they referred to the decision of the UN General Assembly in 2013, when it proclaimed the period 2015 to 2024 as International Decade for People of African Descent. And it said that the theme of the decade would be people of African descent, recognition, justice, and development. And naturally, the objectives of the decade must be of special interest to all of us. One of these objectives, for instance, is and I quote, to strengthen national, regional, and international action and cooperation in relation to the full enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights by people of African descent, and their full and equal participation in all aspects of society. Further to this, all of us will recall again, as our colleagues have just said, that the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in Durban, South Africa, took important decisions directly relevant to the purposes of our conference. And these are contained, as again, as the minister has just said, in his Durban Declaration and Program of Action. One of these decisions led to the establishment of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, which working group remains very active to this day. As recently as December last year, the working group issued an important document entitled Operational Guidelines on the Inclusion of People of African Descent in the 2030 Agenda. That is inclusion in the Sustainable Development Goals. And consistent with the general thrust of what we have said in our own preparatory conference documents, the working group says in these guidelines that the working group provides compelling human rights arguments as to why there should be a special focus on people of African descent as one of the population groups who face multiple and compounded forms of discrimination and should be prioritized to end inequalities and discrimination, leave no one behind, and reach the furthest behind first. And they refer to the international human rights law and available official and unofficial data. And that guideline goes on to say that the UN Working Group believes that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by heads of state and government at the UN Summit in September 2015 provides a vehicle to address the racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, Afrophobia, and related intolerance that people of African descent face every day around the world. And the guideline proceeds to say that with each of the 17, it proceeds to deal with each of the 17 SDGs. Here as an example, I'd like to cite part of what the guideline says with regard to the first and third of the SDGs. As conference and all of us know, SDG 1 says, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. In this regard, the guideline then says, inter alia, states should disaggregate data about poverty and people of African descent where data does not exist. Disaggregated data can inform on the extent of possible inequality and discrimination faced by people of African descent according to a human rights-based approach to data and in accordance with states' human rights obligations. And where data exists, baseline studies should be conducted to evaluate the disparities, understand the root causes, and develop remedies to ensure the right to an adequate standard of living is realized. That's a guideline with regard to SDG 1. SDG 3 says, ensure healthy life and promote well-being for all at all ages. And in this instance, the guideline says in part that states should provide reliable data regarding maternal mortality and proportion of births attended by skilled health personnel within the Afro-descendant population. States should ensure that efforts aimed at decreasing maternal mortality are effective within that Afro-descendant population. And specific programs to this effect should be implemented, and states should support participatory qualitative data collection and analysis that allows communities to play a role in designing and implementing culturally sensitive health programs focused on decreasing maternal mortality. Beyond this, moderator, I must also cite another United Nations initiative, which has just been mentioned. You mentioned this, and I'm talking about the General Assembly adopted in August this year, a resolution which formally operationalized a body called the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And I was indeed very glad to hear that your co-convener has been joined as part of this permanent forum. Because the General Assembly said that that forum was a consultative mechanism for people of African descent and other relevant stakeholders as a platform for improving the safety and quality of life and livelihoods of people of African descent, as well as an advisory body to the Human Rights Council in line with the program of activities for the implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent and in close coordination with existing mechanisms. And it went on to say, in part, that the mandate of the forum is to contribute to the full political, economic, and social inclusion of people of African descent in the societies in which they live as equal citizens, without discrimination of any kind, and contribute to ensuring equal enjoyment of all human rights. Mr. Moderator, I've quoted the relevant United Nations document at some length because they provide important guidelines about some of what our conference must do as a working session and platform for open discussion to inform and develop strategies that will radically change the conditions in which Africa and the African diaspora find themselves. And one of the strengths of these documents is that they emanate from a very inclusive intergovernmental body, the United Nations Organization. In principle, therefore, what they say constitutes a common commitment by all the UN member states, and consequently all the countries which are home to people of African descent. Another of these strengths is that the documents go beyond making general statements, important as these are. They go further to spell out the detailed programs required to give practical effect to the general statements. All this means that each of the specific contingents, which together make up our conference participants, and every fragment of the great humanity which constitutes that segment, that is Africans as a whole, has a very legitimate possibility to intervene with our respective governments to encourage them to implement the action plans they have approved through the United Nations. In this context, I would suggest that our conference should formally endorse Agenda 2030, the SDG program of action, as a common platform which unites us as a formation seeking the upliftment of people of Africans generally, that would include people of African descent. And I must say in that context, of course, that this Agenda 2030 I'm saying Agenda 2063 of the African Union is very much consistent with what Agenda 2030 says. Our conference should also answer the important question: what should we do further to strengthen the institutions in the UN system dedicated to promoting the interests of people of African descent? In addition, we should recognize the reality that the fact that, quite understandably, the global community has had to focus on the fight to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic, that has reduced the focus on Agenda 2030. And we, Africans, everywhere, would be among the greatest beneficiaries of a successful achievement of Agenda 2030. It therefore stands to reason that we owe it to ourselves to be among the most passionate activists for the sustained pursuit of the SDGs. Our conference should discuss what we should do in this regard. And as all of us know, the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, constitute a truly ambitious program, which, as the working group of experts on people of African descent has said, provides a vehicle to address the racism, the racial discrimination, the xenophobia, the Afrophobia, and related intolerance that people of African descent face every day around the world, unquote. This is confirmed by the statement made in the preamble of the UN document, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And that statement says that all countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want, and to heal and secure our planet. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. And as we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. And this solemn commitment both makes perfect sense and is very inspiring to all of us as Africans everywhere in the world, especially as it pledges that no one will be left behind. I would like to suggest that our conference is faced with a particular strategic challenge with regard to all of the matters I've mentioned relating to the UN program, which addresses the needs of people of African descent. The challenge is to consider in what ways this defining program can be extended to apply to the African continent as well. In this regard, we should recall the 2000 Millennium Declaration of the United Nations, which made specific provisions for Africa in the context of the Millennium Development Goals under the heading, Meeting the Special Needs of Africa. You will remember that the declaration said that we will support the consolidation of democracy in Africa and assist Africans in their struggle for lasting peace, for poverty eradication, and sustainable development, thereby bringing Africa into the mainstream of the world economy. And it therefore resolved in that declaration to take special measures to address the challenges of poverty eradication and sustainable development in Africa. The imperative, program director, the imperative to meet the special needs of Africa, like those of the African diaspora, remains to this day. I'm saying the imperative to meet the special needs of Africa, like those of the African diaspora, remains to this day. And that is exactly why, the chairperson, I'm suggesting that the provisions that the United Nations has agreed to with regards to people of African descent should be inclusive of all Africans. Because indeed the problems faced by Africans, whether in the diaspora or on the continent, are the same. Where we already have a set of programs agreed by an inclusive, multilateral, intergovernmental body like the United Nations, which has gone into some detail into looking at what is this thing that impacts negatively on Africans. I'm saying that a program like that needs to reach all Africans and not just the African diaspora. Therefore, I'm saying the challenge of our conference is to say, what do we do in order to make sure that these policies which are already in place also impact on the Africans everywhere, including the Africans on the continent. At this point, we should perhaps take a step back in time to return to the question posed in the preparatory documents of our conference. What progress have we made as people of African descent? What progress have we achieved since the 1945 Pan-African Conference? But I believe that to answer this question properly, we must go further back to 1900, to an event to which Minister Mthethwa just referred, and with all of you, I'm certain are very familiar. And I'm talking about what, in my view, was in fact the very first Pan-African Conference. And the conference closed with an address to the nations of the world, delivered by that outstanding American Pan-Africanist, W.E.B. Du Bois. And again, as the minister said, this is how the address began. In the metropolis of the modern world, in the closing year of the 19th century, there has been assembled a Congress of men and women of African blood to deliberate solemnly upon the present situation and outlook of the darker races of mankind. And the problem, he said, of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The question as to how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the color of skin and the texture of the hair, will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization, unquote. Moderator, we're now as you know, we're now in the third decade of the 21st century. The assessments by the United Nations of the socioeconomic condition of peoples of African descent globally suggests that we should repeat, after W.E.B. Du Bois, that the problem of the 21st century is still the problem of the color line. And like its predecessor during the 20th century, the Fifth Pan-African Conference met in Manchester, England in 1945, precisely to address the problem of the color line. And one of the outstanding outcomes of the conference was the adoption of the important document, The Challenge to the Colonial Powers, which said, among others, as I'm sure all of us know, we are determined to be free. We want education. We want the right to earn a decent living, the right to express our thoughts and emotions, to adopt and create forms of beauty. We demand for Black Africa autonomy and independence so far and no further than it is possible in this one world for groups and peoples to rule themselves, subject to inevitable world unity and federation. And it said, we condemn the monopoly of capital and the rule of private wealth and industry for private profit alone. We welcome economic democracy as the only real democracy. Therefore, we shall complain, appeal, and arraign. We will make the world listen to the facts of our condition. We will fight in every way we can for freedom, democracy, and social betterment. You will notice, Chairperson, that challenge to the colonial powers for the independence of the oppressed, of the colonized, does not talk only about being free. It talks about education, earning a decent living, expressing our thoughts and emotions, creating beauty, about economic democracy. So that is part of what came out of the 1945 conference as our agenda as Africans. And I'm sure we are saying Africans at, in the continent and in the diaspora. A companion document adopted by the same conference was a declaration to the colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals, which added that the delegates to the 5th Pan-African Conference believe in the right of all peoples to govern themselves. We affirm the right of all colonial people to control their own destiny, and all colonies must be free from foreign imperial control, whether political or economic. And the people of the colonies must have the right to elect their own governments without restrictions from foreign powers. We say to the peoples of the colonies that they must fight for these ends by all the means at their disposal. And indeed, this is what happened in Africa, in the Caribbean. We must also recall that another important matter was raised at the conference. And this is a matter of the place of women in society. One of the organizers of the conference was the leading Pan-Africanist in her day, Amy Ashwood Garvey. She chaired the very first session of the Congress, of the conference, and on a later day opened the session by addressing the gender question. And during this session, she said, very much has been written and spoken on the Negro. But for some reason, very little has been said about the Black woman. She has been shunted to the background to be a child bearer. This has principally been her lot, unquote. Born in Jamaica, she, together with another woman delegate also from Jamaica, Alma Labadi, ensured that the Congress resolution on the West Indies addressed this matter specifically. Accordingly, that resolution on the West Indies adopted at the 5th Pan-African Conference included demands for equal pay for equal work, regardless of nationality, creed, or race, for the removal of all disabilities affecting the employment of women. For example, the removal of the bar on married women in government services, and called for the modernization of existing laws on children born out of wedlock, with legal provisions for the registration of fathers with adequate safeguards. Unfortunately, it was only the resolution on the West Indies which included the important matter of the emancipation of women. However, this was a beginning we must follow. And I'm quite certain this is what our discussions yesterday must have focused on. The South African Peter Abrahams was one of the leading delegates at that Pan-African Conference and was chosen as the publicity secretary. And in that capacity, he wrote a document which he entitled The Congress in Perspective, and in which he said inter alia that the 5th Pan-African Congress was held in the Charlton Town Hall in Manchester from October 13th to 21st, 1945. Some 200 delegates holding mandates from political, social, trade union organizations attended. The Congress, therefore, was the most representative yet assembled by African and peoples of African descent to plan and work for the liquidation of imperialism. And he said, we see then that the colonial struggle has entered a new phase, a militant phase. It is important that the left in Britain and other imperialist countries should recognize this and aid it. But while militant, this phase is not chauvinistic, narrow, or racial. It is positive and constructive. This is evident in the declarations made at the Congress and the resolutions adopted by it, which are recorded in this report. It is a synthesis of experience and deliberate opinion that clearly reflects the political, economic, and social aspirations of Africans and peoples of African descent. And he said it constitutes a program upon which the struggle for national liberation and social emancipation of the colonial and colored peoples will be based, a struggle which must be fought and won before we can establish the sanctuary of the common man, unquote. As Peter Abrahams said, the decisions of the 1945 Pan-African Conference reflected the political and economic social aspirations of Africans and peoples of African descent. The question, therefore, is what progress have we made in the struggle to realize these aspirations and thus respond effectively to the challenge of the problem of the color line? And needless to say, the most outstanding outcome of the 5th Pan-African Congress was and is it the independence of all the colonized peoples in Africa and the Caribbean, except Western Sahara, and therefore the creation of the possibility for all the Africans concerned to enjoy and exercise their right to self-determination. The reality, however, is that to date, the exercise of that right has not succeeded to address all the political, economic, and social aspirations, which, according to Peter Abrahams, were expressed in the decisions of the 5th Pan-African Congress. We must also add that in the period after 1945, the people of African descent in the United States, the African Americans, conducted a mighty struggle to end the pervasive racial discrimination which continued to persist. However, as is the case in Africa and the Caribbean, much remains to be done in the US to realize the 1945 aspirations. This also holds true with regard to the situation of people of African descent in Latin America, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. And thus do we, people of African descent, have an obligation to rally around and unite in action to achieve what the UN General Assembly described as full enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights by people of African descent and their full and equal participation in all aspects of society. And here I'm talking about all Africans, wherever they are in Africa and the African diaspora. And Mr. Chairman, to achieve our cohesion in this regard, we must attach to ourselves the proud and common identity, the Pan-Africanists. After all, the African-American poet and scholar, Robert Christman, has said the Pan-African vision has as its basic premise that we, the people of African descent throughout the globe, constitute a common cultural and political community by virtue of our origin in Africa and common racial, social, and economic oppression. It further maintains that political and economic cultural unity is essential among all Africans to bring about effective action for the liberation and progress of the African peoples and nations. The Pan-African vision has its basic premise that we, these people, these Africans, share these common challenges. And we must therefore unite in action for the liberation and progress of the African peoples and nations. Thank you very much for your attention and best wishes for the success of this Pan-African Congress. Thank you very much, Reverend Chikane.
Thank you, President. Unfortunately, I don't know how we clap hands on this virtual system, but would like to thank you very much for taking us on this journey. I think you've mapped up where we are and where we should go, and the issues that should be part of the agenda of this conference. And so I just want to say to those who are participating, both directly and via streaming, etc., that the address, including that of the minister and all the presentations, will be put on the website so you can actually follow them. There will be a link as well for each session of this week, which you can listen to during your own time. There are lots of comments, President, which have gone into the chat group. I'm taking it that our support group, the operational team, is making notes, recording that so we don't lose those comments about what the former president has said. I just want to say, President, I feel like those who were at the Manchester conference, that we are at the verge of tilting the power dynamics of the world to force it to change and put Africans, and I now have revised my language, President. I know I must never now say Africans and people of African descent. I'm going to say people of African descent. We are all people of African descent. That we should be able to put them at the cutting edge of developments in the world, and you talked about that part of it. And so I am convinced that in my training, as you know, President, that we used to calculate balance of forces. We need to change the balance of forces in a way that the world cannot ignore us. And I think that's really what we would want to achieve. So I would like to say thank you very much for this keynote address. We have a partner in you, sir, and we, as a patron also of this conference, we are looking forward to working with you into the future. Thank you very much. I can't clap my hands, so I.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Thanks a lot, Reverend Chikane.
Yeah, let me just do a vote of thanks before we release our guests. Thanking all the speakers who spoke today. I would like to also thank the host university and its schools, the Wits Business School and the Wits School of Governance. We also want to recognize the universities that also participated, either in preparation or some tasks. That's the University of Johannesburg, which hosted the pre-AAD reparations conversation, and the results of that will come to the conference. And the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs, which we are working on the exhibition on the history of African and people of African descent. I would like to thank the South African Host Committee that carried the greater part of the preparations, and the planning committee, the operational team. Thank you very much. And then, of course, the international leadership team, which convenes what we have been calling Manchester Conference meetings. I would like to thank all of you and all the participants who have joined us to participate. There are also the various organizations that form part of the host committee, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the Unleashing Leadership Potential, Biko Foundation, the South African Council of Churches, and all of them. I would like to thank you greatly. Mr. President and the Minister, I don't know how we retreat to a holding room to have tea with you and bid you farewell. but I think technology will assist us to do it into the future. We're now going to break, and when we break, the technical team will assist us to get a link into the next session, which starts immediately after this. And the link they will give us will also, the chat section will also assist us to choose which group we are going to get to. So the groups are going to be Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, Latin America, North America. And those who come from Asia and Oceania will join us in the different groups, and would like to encourage those who are on the African continent who might have come in their numbers, would like you to also join the other regions so that we can learn from their experiences. They know exactly what to do in those groups. And so I would like to bring this session to an end and then hand over to the technical team